The movie is set in the distant future, where we meet a man named Frank Lerner. He's looking at a picture in a shop before getting tased in the back by two gunmen. He then wakes up in a futuristic cell and notices his hand is bandaged. He gets up and tries to walk, but he's in bad shape. Frank then meets Howard, who claims to be Frank's LSO, life support unit, and he is monitoring Frank from another room via the camera and speaker. Frank asks where he is, but Howard assumes Frank must have been told in the admission and staging phases. Frank reveals no one told him anything, and he doesn't even remember how he got here. Howard reveals he's only here to adjust Frank into the ISN cell. Frank realizes he's been arrested by ISN, the Interplanetary Security Network, which is a government surveillance organization. Frank tells Howard that he didn't do anything and asks what he is being detained for. Howard reveals Frank is being processed, and he can't have any contact till they're done. Frank reveals he's innocent and tells Howard to check, but Howard doesn't have any access. Howard reveals his job is to ensure that Frank remains alive for this program. Now, we see a memory of Frank waking up in his home while back in the cell. Howard informs Frank of the different services he can provide, which involve food and drinks. He also mentions letting Frank go for a walk, so Frank quickly agrees for a walk. Frank expects to head out, but a door opens and presents a treadmill for Frank. Frank gets impatient and demands speaking to Howard's supervisor, but Howard reveals he doesn't have any. He mentions he got here through a server program, meaning a computer is his supervisor. Frank wants to speak to someone who has answers, but Howard doesn't have access, so Frank gets irate. We see another memory of Frank getting dressed and preparing a USB drive. The news reports the disappearance of Fletcher May, the leader of the Alliance, a resistance group that's fighting against the ISN. Frank looks outside his window and sees dozens of ISN drones in the city before heading out. Now, back in the cell, Howard and Frank get to know each other. Frank is from the South Side, and Howard is from Texas but grew up in an unfamiliar city in Seattle. Frank is having a hard time as to why Howard joined the ISN and how he's pretending like he's not torturing him for a living. Howard asks about Frank's job, but he doesn't answer.
What do you do for a job?
Christ.
Frank now decides to eat, but his food is goo of different flavors. The food reminds him of his dog, so he asks Howard if he can send someone to his apartment to check up on his dog. Howard mentions he can't contact anyone, so Frank loses his cool, and Howard turns the lights off. We see another memory of Frank in a train, thinking about his ill father. Frank heads into the city alley, where he gets noticed by a drone. Frank now wakes up in the cell and asks Howard for water. Howard notices urine in the cell and reveals there's a bathroom for Frank. Frank enters the bathroom, but Howard locks him in. Frank hears a machine in the cell, and when the door opens, he sees the cell is all cleaned up now. We see another memory of Frank where he walks into a coffee shop. He meets a lovely waitress named Gabby who makes a simple coffee for him. Frank now eats the goo in his cell and hates it. He talks with Howard about the food and notices his responses are strange. Frank realizes Howard isn't a person but an AI computer.
Howard.
Yes, Frank.
Howard.
Yes, Frank.
Howard.
Yes, Frank.
Howard now tries to break free from the room while thinking about Gabby. He fails to escape, so he sits in his chair and asks Howard about his design. Frank seems to know a lot about AI models and tech, so Howard questions how he knows so much.
You seem to know a lot about computers. Why is that?
But Frank doesn't answer. Frank mentions he despises machines and believes not everything is supposed to be computerized. We see Frank's coffee memory again with Gabby. Gabby is trying to figure out Frank's name, but gets it wrong each time. We see a red monitoring light in the shop, while Frank checks out the pictures behind him. Gabby reveals she took the pictures herself and asks Frank for his hand. She grabs Frank's hand and guesses his name right. Frank looks at the pictures again, and one of them is the same picture we saw in the beginning. Suddenly, two gunmen approach Frank and stun him from behind. At night, Frank wakes up and notices the ventilation system. He thinks of the same memories again, which are of how his day started, the day he got arrested. He finds himself with Gabby again, who guesses his name again. Frank freaks out and gets stunned by the gunman and feels the pain in real life, in the cell. Later, Frank asks Howard's primary protocols, which are to keep Frank alive and contained till his processing. Frank realizes this cell is the processing, so he tries to cooperate with Howard and reveals why he hates machines. Frank's dad died of heart disease, and when he got sick, the doctors put him on a machine that made him live 4 more years, but only in the hospital. He hated the extended life his father got to live, and hates the technological future because of it. Later, Howard mentions he found out Frank was charged for DL9, meaning conspiring against the ISN. Frank doesn't understand what that means, but Howard mentions there's a pending repair request for Howard, which can be denied if he isn't damaged. Frank realizes it can be his ticket out, so he tries to hit Howard. Howard mentions there are security protocols for Frank, but Frank doesn't care. He smacks Howard, but suddenly, a gas is released in the cell. Frank faints, and we see flashes of him getting injected in a different place. We see Frank in the coffee shop again, but this time he's not talking with anyone. The shop is about to close afterward, and Gabby approaches him with a free coffee. Frank mentions the men from ISN haven't showed up to detain him. Gabby is still trying to figure out his name, so Frank tries to explain to her that she is just his memory, and not real. He realizes the ISN isn't here yet because Gabby didn't charge him, so the scanner didn't activate. Gabby asks for his help to close her shop, and while setting the chairs, Frank notices the monitor for the scanner. He orders a coffee, and Gabby charges him, which activates the scanner. Frank realizes the monitor is displaying someone else's IDP number, and he's being arrested falsely. The ISN arrive and taser him. Frank discusses with Howard about the IDP number and decides to figure out whose number was it. He decides to go through his memories again and sees all the things he did that day. Before he enters the coffee shop, he notices giant explosions in the city, and he wakes up in his cell where everything is malfunctioning. Howard stops responding, so Frank thinks someone's here to rescue him. He calls for help and waits, but no one arrives. After a while, Frank hears a thud and notices someone else is in the other room. He sees a man from the cell duct who happens to be Fletcher May, the resistance leader. Fletcher reveals he's also a prisoner here, and he's trying to escape. Fletcher asks Frank if he's with the Alliance, but Frank doesn't answer. Fletcher mentions he found a rod in the bathroom walls and uses it to break the duct. Fletcher is hoping his resistance members will come to rescue him, and after waiting for hours, no one arrives for him. Fletcher loses hope and tries to off himself, but the security protocols release gas. Frank now wakes up in his bed, and the cell is back to normal. Howard has returned, but he's been rebooted, so he doesn't remember anything now. Frank loses hope and visits his memory again. He avoids buying anything from Gabby, and when he notices the scanner being activated, he quickly hides. Gabby tries to comfort him, but Frank tries to get her off his back because she's just a memory. He reveals that he's being held in a government facility where he's under a neuroscanner, which is an interrogation tactic to scan his memory for evidence. Frank now shares his cell experiences with Gabby. Frank is stuck in a loop now where he's constantly revisiting his memories and surviving in the cell. Frank's also improvising his memories, so he comes up with a plan to take down the ISN guards with Gabby. They take their guns and question why they're after Frank, but none of them answer. Frank lets them go because he realizes it's just his memory, and they can't reveal anything. Gabby still offers her support, so Frank holds her. But she's also not real. After some time, Frank notices that Howard's system deteriorates for 12 seconds, so he starts planning his escape with Gabby in his memory. We now also see a new memory of Frank, which reveals Frank is holding a lot of information against the ISN. He plans to escape tonight and says his goodbyes to Gabby. Gabby makes him promise to find her in the real world, so Frank agrees, and kisses her goodbye as the ISN guard arrives in the shop again. Frank wakes up in the cell and wears his uniform. He asks Howard for a coffee, and then asks to use the bathroom. He doesn't use the bathroom and puzzles Howard, which makes him turn off for 12 seconds again. Frank quickly covers Howard with his pillowcase and uses the rod that he ripped from the bathroom walls. He waits as the security gas releases and a mini robot enters the cell for security measures. Frank jams the rod in the bot and escapes the cell. He looks around for an exit and finds a ladder that leads to an exit hatch. Frank finds himself in the middle of a desert and starts running away. After hours, Frank reaches a highway and enters a gas station. There, he quickly drinks water and notices the pictures from Gabby's shop. Frank is appalled and finds himself in the cell again, where everything is reset again, meaning the cell isn't a real place to escape, and it's all part of the interrogation program. Frank is completely hopeless now, as he's completely stuck. More time passes by as Frank now gives up and confesses. He reveals he's a member of the Alliance, and he created a virus that was going to crash the ISN. The virus was in his USB, and the ISN wants to know its location, which is why they're scanning his memories. Frank mentions if he gives up the USB, then the ISN will lock him in here forever. He tells Howard that their resources are depleting, so he needs to let him go. Howard doesn't agree, so Frank decides to hang himself. The security protocols kick in, and the little bot enters the cell again. The bot shoots off Frank's noose and tries to attack him, but Frank manages to escape with Howard's help. Frank now circles back to Howard's room, bidding him adieu and shutting him off. Frank now escapes the building again, but this time he finds himself in the snowy mountains. He escapes and comes across the trees he saw in Gabby's pictures. Two hikers notice Frank and rescue him as we hear on the news that more members of the Alliance were stuck for 2 years like Frank, because the ISN was overthrown. None of them survived except Frank. Frank now heads into Gabby's shop, and it is revealed he hid the USB behind Gabby's picture. Frank throws the USB in the bin and meets Gabby, whose real name is Madeline. Madeline starts guessing his name again as we see Howard is still monitoring him. The movie ends here. Thank you for being a part of our video. If these tales of mystery and intrigue sent shivers down your spine, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more bone-chilling narratives. Stay tuned. And until next time, stay captivated.